Seventh graders, how are you? This is Mrs. Lombardi, and this is the last chapter of Revenge of the Whale, chapter 14, which is titled Consequences. George Pollard took to his second command with optimism. Remember, he has been hired to go on the Two Brothers as captain. So he has gone on his second command with optimism that was remarkable, considering what had happened to his first. In the winter of 1822, he successfully brought the Two Brothers around Cape Horn, headed her up the west coast of South America, and provisioned her at the Peruvian port of Paita. In mid-August, the Two Brothers spoke the U.S. Navy schooner Water Witch. Aboard the Water Witch was a 24-year-old midshipman named Charles Wilkes. As it so happened, Wilkes had read a newspaper account of the Essex disaster. Wilkes asked Pollard how, after all that he had suffered, he could dare go to sea again. He simply remarked, and Wilkes wrote, that it was an old adage, that the lightning never struck in the same place twice. But in this case of Captain Pollard, it did. In February of 1823, the Two Brothers and another Nantucket whale ship, the Martha, were sailing west toward a new whaling ground. In the few years since the start of Pollard's previous voyage, much had changed in the Pacific whale fishery. Soon after the opening of the offshore ground in 1819, Nantucket whale ships had stopped at the Hawaiian island of Oahu for the first time. That same year, Frederick Coffin, captain of the Siren, laid claim to discovering the rich Japan ground. All of the Pacific, not just its eastern and western edges, had become the domain of the Nantucket whalemen. The Two Brothers and the Martha were several hundred miles west of the Hawaiian Islands, headed toward the Japan ground, when it began to blow. Pollard ordered his men to shorten sail. It was raining hard in the high seas, and in the high seas the Two Brothers was proving difficult to steer. The Martha was the faster of the two whale ships, and as night came on, the lookout of the Two Brothers could barely see her from the masthead. They were sailing at about the same latitude as the French frigate Shoals, a deadly maze of rocks and coral reef, to the northwest of the Hawaiian Islands. But both Pollard and Captain John Pease of the Martha judged themselves to be well to the west of danger. Since his previous voyage, Pollard had learned how to determine his ship's longitude by lunar observation. However, owing to overcast skies, it had been more than 10 days since he had been able to take a lunar. So he had to rely on dead reckoning to determine the ship's position. It was blowing so hard that the whaleboats had been taken off the davits and lashed to the deck. That night, one of the officers remarked that the water alongside looked whiter than usual. Thomas Nickerson was about to retrieve a jacket from down below when he noticed Pollard standing on the ship's railing, staring down worriedly into the sea. While Nickerson was below decks, the ship struck something. With a fearful crash, and he was thrown to the floor. Nickerson assumed they had collided with another ship. "Judge of my astonishment," he wrote, "to find ourselves surrounded with breakers, apparently mountains high, and our ship careening over upon her broadside and thumping so heavily that one could scarcely stand upon his feet. The ship was being pounded to pieces on a coral reef." Captain Pollard seemed to stand amazed at the scene before him, Nickerson remembered. First Mate Eben Gardner took charge. He ordered the men to begin cutting down the masts in hopes of saving the ship, realizing that the spars would likely fall across and crush the whaleboats tied to the deck. Pollard finally came to life. He commanded the crew to put away their axes and begin readying the boats. Had the masts of the ships been cut away at that time, Nickerson wrote, I would probably have adorned this tale instead of told it. But by the time the men began crowding into the boats, Pollard had Pollard had lapsed into his former state of mesmerized despair. His reasoning powers had flown, Nickerson remembered, and the captain appeared unwilling to leave the ship. So as this is all kind of happening, Pollard is really struggling mentally. Obviously, you can imagine why, but he cannot take command. He keeps freezing up. Nickerson remembered that the captain was unwilling to leave his ship. The waves threatened to bash the boats again against the hull as the men pleaded with their commander to save himself. Captain Pollard reluctantly got into the boat, Nickerson wrote, just as they were about to shove off from the ship. Nickerson, who at 17 years old had been promoted to boat steerer, was standing at the steering oar when a huge wave slammed into the boat and threw him into the sea. One of the mates reached out to him with the blade of the after oar. Nickerson grabbed it and was pulled back into the boat. The two whaleboats were quickly separated in the darkness. Our boat seemed to be surrounded with breakers, Nickerson remembered, and we were compelled to row between them all night, for we could see no outlet. The next morning, they saw a ship anchored to the lee of a 50-foot-high rock. It proved to be the Martha, which had narrowly escaped crashing into the rock the night before. Soon, all of the two brothers' crew had been rescued, and the Martha was on her way to Oahu. 2 months later, in the harbor of Raiatea, one of the Society Islands, a missionary named George Bennett boarded the U.S. brig the Pearl, which was bound for Boston. Among the passengers was George Pollard. The 31-year-old captain had greatly changed since he'd talked to Charles Wilkes less than a year before. His former cheerfulness had disappeared, yet anchored in the harbor of an island that he and his men had once spurned in the mistaken fear of cannibals, he insisted on telling Bennett the story of the Essex in painful detail. This time, when it came to describing the execution of Owen Coffin, he broke off. "But I can tell you no more," he cried out to Bennett. "My head is on fire at the recollection, and I hardly know what to say." Pollard finished the conversation by relating how he had recently lost his second whale ship on a shoal off the Hawaiian Islands. Then, in what Bennett called a tone of despondency, never to be forgotten by him or who heard it, Pollard confessed, "Now I am utterly ruined. No owner will ever trust me with a whaler again, for all will say I am an unlucky man." So I would agree with that. As you can imagine, Pollard was given an opportunity to be the captain of the two brothers, and luck is not on his side. He managed to run that ship into a coral reef. Luckily, every man on board escaped, and it was by no means the escape and rescue that it was for the Essex, but all the same, it wasn't good news. As Pollard predicted, his whaling career was over. The island that had rallied so quickly behind him after the sinking of the Essex now turned its back. He had become a Jonah, which means a twice-doomed captain whom no one dared to give a third chance. After returning to his wife Mary, Pollard made a single voyage in a merchant vessel out of New York. But not liking that business, Nickerson wrote, he returned to his home on Nantucket. He became a night watchman, a position on the lowest rung of the island's social ladder. As a whaleman, now we're shifting gears here. As a whaleman, Owen Chase would enjoy the success that had eluded George Pollard. His personal life, however, proved less fortunate. Chase's first voyage after the sinking of the Essex as first mate aboard the New Bedford whale ship the Florida lasted less than 2 years and reaped 2,000 barrels of oil. When he returned to Nantucket in 1823, he found his second child, Lydia, toddling after her older sister Phoebe Ann, now approaching 4. Chase chose to remain on island for the birth of his next child, a son who was named William Henry. Owen's wife, Peggy, did not recover from the delivery. She died less than 2 weeks later. Owen was now a 27-year-old widower with 3 children to care for. So he had a successful time on his first trip which was on the Florida, and it was a very short trip. And he came home to another baby, and then stayed on Nantucket for the birth of his third child. And during that labor, his wife did not make it. So he basically has 3 children, and his wife has died, which wasn't uncommon during that time. Childbirth was a dangerous thing. Owen was now in the fall and winter of 1824 and 1825, he came to know a woman with whom he already shared a special bond. Nancy Slade Joy was the widow of Matthew Joy, second mate of the Essex. In June of 1825, 9 months after the death of Peggy Chase, the widow and widower were married, and Nancy became the stepmother of Owen's 3 children. In early August, Chase sails for New Bedford, where he took command of his first vessel, the Winslow, meaning he was the captain. The Winslow was a small whale ship and carried only 15 men. On July 20th, 1827, after a voyage of almost 2 years, she returned to New Bedford with 1,440 barrels of oil. After a brief reunion with his family on Nantucket, Chase was back in New Bedford, and by the second week in August, preparing for another voyage. Chase's almost decade-long professional banishment from Nantucket ended in 1830, soon after his return from his second full voyage as a captain of the Winslow. At age 33, he was offered command of what was to be one of the largest ships in Nantucket whale fishery. Until then, almost all the island ships were built on the mainland, in places such as Rochester and Hanover, Massachusetts. But whaling had brought a tremendous surge of wealth to the island. The profit margins were now high enough that it was deemed economically feasible to build a whale ship at the island's Brant Point shipyard, even though all the materials had to be transported across Nantucket Sound. Over the next 2 years, the 376-ton copper-fastened whale ship Charles Carroll took shape under Chase's experienced eye, and with an investment of $625, he was given a 1 in 32 owner's share in the vessel. So Chase is getting himself involved now with a ship that was built on Nantucket. Chase's first voyage as a captain on the Charles Carroll was a financial success, and after 3.5 years, and he was the captain as well. After 3.5 years, he returned in March of 1836 with 2,610 barrels of oil, almost twice the return of his first voyage as captain aboard the Winslow. But the voyage came at a great personal cost. 9 months after her husband left the island, Nancy Chase gave birth to a daughter, Adeline, and a few weeks later, Nancy was dead. Greeting their father at the wharf in the spring of 1836 were Phoebe Ann, almost 16, Lydia, 13, William Henry, 11, and Adeline, who was 2.5, a girl who had no money, no memory of her mother, and had never known her father. Chase wasn't home a month before he had remarried Eunice Chadwick. She was just 27 years old, and she now had 4 stepchildren to care for. By the end of August, after less than 5 months of marriage, she was waving goodbye to her new husband. This was to be Chase's last voyage as a whaling captain. He was 40 years old, and if all went well, he would be able to retire to his house on Orange Street. So that was quite a little, he was successful as a whaleman. In his personal life, he lost 2 wives and remarried with 4 children. Also in the Pacific during this period was a young man whose whaling career was just beginning. Herman Melville, first signed on in 1840 as a hand aboard the New Bedford whale ship, the Acushnet. During a gam in the Pacific, he met a Nantucketer by the name of William Henry Chase, Owen Chase's teenage son. So I'm going to say that again. So Herman Melville, we know as the great author of Moby Dick. Moby Dick was a made-up story, but it is one of the classic American literature pieces in the United States. Herman Melville was the author. So Herman Melville was a whaleman on the whale ship, the Acushnet, and he met up with a man named William Henry Chase, which was Owen Chase's son. Melville had already heard stories about the Essex from the sailors aboard the Acushnet and closely questioned the boy about his father's experiences. The next morning, William pulled out a copy of Owen's Essex narrative from his sea chest and loaned it to Melville. The reading of this wondrous story upon the landless sea, Melville remembered, and so close to the very latitude of the shipwreck, had a surprising effect on me. Later in the voyage, during a gam with another whale ship, Melville caught a glimpse of a Nantucket whaling captain who he was told was none other than Owen Chase. He was a large, powerful, well-made man, Melville would later write in the back pages of his own copy of Chase's narrative, rather tall, to all appearances something past 45 or so, with a handsome face of a Yankee, and an expressive and great uprightness and calm sense of courage. His whole appearance impressed me pleasantly. He was the most prepossessing looking whale hunter I think I ever saw. Although Melville appears to have mistaken another whaling captain for Chase, his description is remarkably similar to a surviving portrait of Owen Chase. It depicts a confident, almost arrogant face, a man completely at ease with the responsibility of command. But Chase's professional assurance would not prepare him for the news he heard midway through his final voyage. 16 months after her husband sailed aboard the Charles Carroll, Eunice Chase, Owen Chase's third wife, gave birth to a son, Charles Frederick. Herman Melville would be told of how Chase received the news, and inevitably, the future author of Moby Dick would compare the plight of the former first mate of the Essex to that of George Pollard. The miserable misfortune which pursued Pollard, the captain, in his second disastrous and entire shipwreck did likewise hunt poor Owen, Melville wrote, though somewhat more dilatory in overtaking him the second time. Melville was told that Chase had received letters informing him of the certain infidelity of his wife. We also heard that his receipt of this news had told most heavily upon Chase, that he was a prey to the deepest gloom. So basically it sounds like Chase's wife was, his most recent, was cheating on him. A matter of days after his return to Nantucket in the winter of 1840, Chase filed for divorce, and on July 7th, the divorce was granted, with Chase taking over legal guardianship of Charles Frederick. 2 months later, Chase was married for a fourth time to Susan Coffin Gwynn. In the previous 21 years, he had spent only 5 years at home. He would now remain on Nantucket for the rest of his life. So that's a lot of wives. That's a lot of information. The other Essex survivors also returned to the sea. Once they'd been delivered to Oahu after the wreck of the two brothers, Thomas Nickerson and Charles Ramsdell soon found berths on other whale ships. In the 1840s, Ramsdell served as a captain of the General Jackson, which was out of Bristol, Rhode Island. He would marry twice and have a total of 6 children. Nickerson eventually tired of whaling life and became a captain in the merchant service, which was relocating to Brooklyn, New York, where he and his wife Margaret lived for a number of years. They had no children. Benjamin Lawrence served as captain of the whale ship Dromo and Huron, the latter was out of Hudson, New York, home of the Essex second mate Matthew Joy. Lawrence had 7 children, one of whom would die at sea. In the early 1840s, Lawrence, like Chase, retired from the whaling business and purchased a small farm in Sconset on the east end of the island of Nantucket. Less is known about the 3 off-island rescued from Henderson Island. The 2 Cape Codders, Seth Weeks and William Wright, continued as crew members on the Surrey, voyaging throughout the Pacific until they made their way to England and back to the United States. Wright was lost at sea in a hurricane off the West Indies. Weeks eventually retired to Cape Cod, where he would outlive all the other Essex survivors. The Englishman Thomas Chappell returned to London in June of 1823. Then he contributed to a religious tract that wrung every possible spiritual lesson from the story of the Essex disaster. Nickerson later heard of the Englishman's death on a fever-plagued island of Timor. Although townspeople continued to whisper about the Essex well into the 20th century, it was not a topic a Nantucketer openly discussed. When the daughter of Benjamin Lawrence was asked about the disaster, she replied, "We do not mention this in Nantucket." In 1835, when Obed Macy published, with the assistance of William Coffin Jr., his History of Nantucket, New Bedford had eclipsed the island as America's leading whale port. The Nantucket Bar, a mere nuisance in the early days of the Pacific whale fishery, had developed into a major obstacle to prosperity. When we're talking about the Nantucket Bar, we're talking about like the sandbar, which made, for much larger ships, it made it very difficult to get into Nantucket's harbor. So eventually larger ships had to go to New Bedford because they were so heavy they could not get through the sandbar, even at high tide. The whale ships, and this will say it too, the whale ships had become so large they could no longer cross the bar without being almost completely unloaded by smaller vessels known as lighters, a time-consuming and expensive process. In 1842, Peter Folger designed and built 135-foot camels, giant wooden water wings that formed a floating dock, capable of carrying a fully loaded whale ship across the bar. The fact remained, however, that the New Bedford's deep water harbor gave the port a distinct advantage, as did its nearness to the newly emerging railroad system, on which increasing numbers of merchants shipped their oil to market. But Nantucketers also had themselves to blame for the dramatic downturn of the whaling business that would take place on the island in the 1840s. As whalemen from New Bedford, New London, and Sag Harbor opened up new whaling grounds in the North Pacific, Nantucketers stuck stubbornly to the long-since depleted grounds that they had served them so well in the past decades. Long before Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in 1859, Nantucket's economic fate had been determined. Over the next 20 years, the island's population would shrink from 10,000 to 3,000. Nantucket now has a body of death appearance such as few New England towns possess. One visitor wrote, "The houses stand around in faded gentility style. The inhabitants have a dreamy look, as though they live in the memories of the past." Even though whaling would continue out of the New Bedford into the 1920s, Nantucket, the island whose name had once been synonymous with the fishery, had ceased to be an active whaling port for over only 40 years. After the departure of the Essex, on November 16, 1869, Nantucket's last whaling vessel, the Oak, left the harbor and was never to return. Nantucket, once the whaling capital of the world, was all but a ghost town by the time the last survivors of the Essex disaster began to pass away. Charles Ramsdell was the first of the Nantucketers to die in 1866. Throughout his life, he was known for his reticence concerning the Essex. In part, one islander thought, because of his role as Owen Coffin's executioner. Old age was not kind to Owen Chase. His memory of his sufferings in an open boat never left him, and late in life he began hiding food in the attic of his house on Orange Street. Some of you might know this story, and you might have an idea of where his house actually is today. By 1868, Chase was judged insane. The headaches that had plagued him ever since the ordeal had become unbearable. Clutching an attendant's hand, he would sob, "Oh, my head, oh, my head." Death brought an end to Chase's suffering in 1869. George Pollard followed his former first mate the next year. The obituary was careful to note that Pollard had been known on the island as something more than the captain of the Essex. For more than 40 years, he resided permanently among us and leaves a record of a good and worthy man as his legacy. In the 1870s, Thomas Nickerson returned to Nantucket and moved into a house on North Water Street, not far from where his parents were buried in the Old North Burial Ground. Instead of whales, Nantucketers were now after summer visitors, and Nickerson developed a reputation as one of the island's foremost boarding house keepers. One of his guests was the writer Leon Lewis, who, after hearing of Nickerson tell about the Essex, proposed they collaborate on a book about the disaster. Nickerson had talked with Charles Ramsdell about his experiences in the whaleboat with Pollard, and he had also spoken with Seth Weeks on Cape Cod about his time on Henderson Island. As a consequence, Nickerson's narrative provides information that was unavailable to Chase. He also includes important details about the voyage prior to the whale attack, but Nickerson, like Chase before him, was not just above adjusting his account to suit his own purpose. Not wanting to be remembered as a cannibal, he claims that the men in Chase's boat did not eat the body of Isaac Cole. Instead, he insists it was the extra bread made available to them by the deaths of Cole and Peterson that enabled us to exist until they were relieved. He also chose not to recount how, toward the end of the ordeal, he suddenly decided it was his turn to die. In April 1879, Nickerson's last surviving crew member in the first mate's boat was Benjamin Lawrence, who died. All his life, Lawrence had kept the piece of twine he had made while in the whaleboat. At some point, it was passed on to Alexander Starbuck, the Nantucketer who had taken over Obed Macy's role as the island's historian. In 1814, Starbuck would donate the piece of twine wound 4 times into a tiny coil and mounted in a frame to the Nantucket Historical Association. Written with a circle of twine was the inscription, "They were in the boat 93 days." That's still at the Whaling Museum today. That was the picture I was going to show you last chapter, so I'll make sure it's in the slideshow. 18 years earlier, in 1896, the Historical Association had received another donation associated with the Essex. Some time after the ship sank in November 1820, a small chest, 10 by 20 inches, was found floating in the vicinity of the wreck. Leather-bound and studded with brass nails, it may have been used by Captain Pollard to store the ship's papers. It was picked up by the crew of a passing ship and sold to John Tabor, a whaleman, then on his way home to Providence, Rhode Island. In 1896, Tabor's daughter, who had since moved to Garrettsville, Ohio, decided that the chest rightfully belonged on Nantucket and donated the artifact to the Historical Association. It was all that remained of the whale ship Essex, a battered box and a ragged piece of string. And that ends our Revenge of the Whale book. I am getting ready to share with you a slideshow that will have all the information that you need on it. And I look forward to hopefully doing some video check-ins and some talks about this book. And we're also going to do some work on just the end of whaling and how that ended, why it ended. There are a lot of different reasons that came out of the industry ending on the island. The sandbar is one of them, but there are many other factors. So I will be in touch soon. Thanks for listening, guys.